Welcome to the Diabetes Podcast, where real stories meet real science, helping you take charge, not just take medicine. Today we're zooming out. Instead of focusing on individual tips, we're investigating the diabetes epidemic itself. Why a once rare condition is now touching nearly half of U.S. adults when you combine diabetes and prediabetes. Think of it like a century-long mystery. Same human biology, totally different environment. We'll walk through the acts of this story, from the rise of ultra-processed foods and the fall of daily movement, to sleep disruption, chronic stress, and changes in the microbiome and inflammation. No single villain, just a stack of systems and incentives that quietly reshaped how we live, eat, move, and sleep. And we'll end with what it would take to turn this around, at the policy level and in our own homes. It's not your fault, but it can be our fight. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Diabetes Podcast. I'm Richie.
And I'm Amber.
And Amber, today we're getting a little bit off of, I think normally we try and talk about what's going on at the individual level, what you can do to maybe move forward from a health standpoint. This week, we're getting into really why this is such a problem at scale. Why the diabetes epidemic exists, and maybe some of the things that we can do collectively to make it better. Yes.
So we're going to set the scene.
Okay.
It's 1926, 100 years ago.
I was not alive.
I would hope not. Calvin Coolidge is in the White House.
That guy.
The Great Gatsby was published the year before.
Okay.
Most Americans still live in rural areas, and insulin, the hormone that keeps people with diabetes alive, has only been available for about 5 years. In 1926, diabetes is a footnote, a rare diagnosis. Fewer than 1 in 100 Americans have it. Most doctors will go weeks, maybe months, without seeing a case of diabetes. And now we're going to fast forward.
Okay.
It's 2026, 100 years later. And according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 38.4 million Americans have diagnosed diabetes.
Okay.
Another 97.6 million adults have prediabetes.
So a few.
And together, you add these and you got a number that should really cause you to stop dead in your tracks.
I think
really.
It's about half the adult population in the United States.
Yes.
Okay.
So 1 in 2 adults either has diabetes or prediabetes in this country.
And correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm sorry. 1 in 2 has impaired glucose metabolism.
Okay.
So it's a little prediabetes plus type 2 diabetes.
Okay. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, of that pre-diabetes population, the vast majority of that is undiagnosed.
Right.
Okay.
They have no idea
they
have prediabetes.
Okay.
Exactly. So I thought what we would do today is kind of investigate this like a crime scene.
What happened?
That I think means you're Scooby and I'm the little nerd with the glass. What's her name?
Velma?
Velma, yes. So I thought it'd be fun to structure this.
Roll Ramber.
Oh my gosh. I thought it'd be fun to structure this like a murder mystery play with different acts, because this current diabetes epidemic is a crime. And so like if you define a crime as negligent failure to protect human health for the sake of corporate profit or political convenience, like something happened over the past 100 years, over the last 4 generations, and it turned this rare condition into an epidemic, or you could even say a pandemic.
So before we go
the most
too
common
much further, if we're framing it as a murder mystery, usually there's a villain, right?
Ooh,
Somebody that, let's just say, is intentionally doing harm, right?
You did it.
There was a plot, and they probably like had some schemes, and they tried to get away with it to the best of their ability. Let's just be candid. That analogy is probably not going to be 100% accurate, because I think as we're getting into it, it's not that any one person or even groups of people is deliberately set out back and whenever to, with the thought that, by 2026, half of adults in the United States are going to be sick. I don't think that was anybody's intention.
Of course not.
But we are going to kind of elucidate that whether intentional or not, it did happen. We're here.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the who, the what, like why decisions were made, what was removed, what was added, what we were told, and what was actually true. We're going to dive into all of that. So before we go any further, what I really want to make sure everyone understands is that human biology did not change in the past 100 years. Our DNA now is essentially the same as it was 100 years ago. Your great-grandmother's pancreas works the same as your pancreas today. Her insulin receptors were made of the same proteins. Liver processed glucose the same way. So if the hardware didn't change, then the software did.
So while there is a genetic component to type 1 and type 2 diabetes, the genetic piece is not what resulted in the dynamically higher rate of incidence of type 2 diabetes and I believe type 1 as well.
Yeah, we'll get into that piece for sure, because we're really talking about the environment changing. And when the environment changes fast enough and broadly enough, it's not just a few people who are affected. It's an epidemic, and that's what's playing out. So we're not talking about bad genes or lazy people. We're talking about like this decades dominant narrative around type 2, which has been that of personal failure. And that is a myth. It's not that people ate too much, moved too little, made bad choices. That's done enormous damage.
I think I've even seen like a comedian is effectively joking about which diabetes do you have? Is it the one that's your fault? And that's while it may be fine for laughs, not totally accurate.
Very much not accurate.
Not accurate at all.
Yeah. Because when you blame individuals for a population level crisis, that can excuse us from looking at the systems that created it. And you really have to look at the systems that created it if you want to create change. So that's what we're going to look at very much today. So we're going to start at the beginning.
Okay.
All right. So Act 1 in our murder mystery play. This is the baseline. This is 1926 to about 1945.
Okay.
So to understand how we got here, we're going to look at life 100 years ago. In the 1920s and 30s, most Americans ate food that was grown locally or regionally, minimally processed, prepared at home. The average diet was built around whole grains, beans, vegetables, eggs, dairy, and very modest amounts of meat. There were no drive-thrus, no frozen dinners, no ultra-processed snack aisles spreading the length of half a football field.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The time period that we're talking about is kind of like almost around Great Depression. So chances are
it does encompass the Great Depression as well.
The food was kind of what you could get. So there wasn't probably a lot to spend on luxury food items, and you're probably trying to feed as many mouths as cheaply as possible is kind of what it sounds like.
Yeah. And even looking at my grandmother, there's a history of saving 2 tablespoons of cream corn in the freezer, like just little bags of different scraps
You're
that then
get
in the soup later. Yeah. So that's the food portion, but then also people moved constantly, not because they're going to the gym, but because daily life required movement.
Work was work.
Yep.
Yeah.
Farming, walking to school, manual labor, hanging laundry, hauling water. And according
running after 9 kids. Yeah.
Right. Oh my gosh. Yes. And according to estimates from researchers at Pennington Biomedical Research Center, Americans in the early 20th century expended significantly more energy throughout their day, like just getting to and from work and movement at work. And some estimates suggest physical activity levels have dropped more than 30% over the past century, with the steepest declines occurring after 1960. So we're still in that 1920s to 45 timeline, but 1960s saw a really sharp decline. And here's the thing about movement that matters in this story. Your skeletal muscle, we've talked about this in other podcasts, the single largest glucose disposal system in your body. So when your muscles contract, that opens the GLUT4 pathway, which is very insulin independent, like a sponge soaking up the glucose.
If I remember correctly, I think it's 80% of the sugar in your bloodstream can be absorbed by your muscles at any given time. So that's if you're moving regularly, you've already got a B for to some degree sugar management, if you want to think of it that way.
Because that muscle contraction is opening the door for glucose to enter. So in 1926, you had a population eating whole fiber-rich food and moving all day long. So their muscles were constantly clearing glucose. Their insulin sensitivity was high, and their metabolic systems were working in the way that they were designed to work. Diabetes prevalence at that time, less than 1%.
Okay.
So the machine is running the way that it is supposed to, the body machine. And then piece by piece, it starts getting dismantled. Before we get to that, though, let's talk about insulin for a moment because it matters in context. So discovered in 1921 by Banting and Best. And they had their little dog. There's a famous picture of. But before that, and then there's some nuance within that too. But anyway, before that, a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes was essentially a death sentence. Children would waste away. Adults would die within months. But insulin changed everything. It saved millions of lives and remains one of the most important medical advances in human history. But here's something people don't often think about. Before insulin was available, doctors could not keep patients with diabetes alive long enough to really study the long-term progression of the disease. And type 2 diabetes, which develops slowly over years, sometimes decades, was even harder to identify and track. So part of the reason that diabetes appeared rare in 1926 wasn't just because fewer people had it. It was also because that the medical system of that time was not yet fully equipped to find it, measure it, name it. But that said, the epidemiological evidence is still overwhelming. Like even accounting for better direction, the rise of type 2 diabetes over the past century is not an artifact of improved screening. Like that does not account for what happened. Like there's just no way. The trajectory is too steep, too fast, too global to be explained by that diagnostic criteria alone. And so things changed, and they changed in layers, which brings us to Act 2, the first cracks that begin to show up. And this is 1945 to 1970. So we're still not born yet.
But like post-World War II, everybody's coming back, and I've got some degree of a population explosion. Right?
Yeah, so you've got really dramatic transformations in history during that time. You've got the post-war economic boom, which is bringing about the suburbs and
modern
automobile
conveniences.
culture. Yes, and really critically, the industrialization of the American food supply.
Okay.
And so we're going to take these one at a time. You've got the suburbs and the car. So the car allowed for the suburbs. You've got to drive into town to get the groceries. You can't just walk to the store. So before the war, most Americans lived in workable communities. Cities, small towns, they were all designed around foot traffic, and streetcars were very short distances at that time. After the war, the suburbs exploded. In those 20 years between 1950 and 1970, the suburban population of the United States nearly doubled. Mm-hmm. And the suburbs, you just had to drive. Once you lived outside of those urban areas, you drove everywhere. And that was the first large-scale removal of incidental movement from daily life, like just going about your daily tasks. So not exercise movement, the kind of low-level, constant physical activity that keeps muscles engaged, keeps that glucose metabolism engine humming and purring. It just quietly disappeared over that time. And nobody really noticed that this happened. It's just gradual. It was replaced by something that felt like progress.
Yeah. How easy and convenient it is.
Yeah. It's a good thing, right? All good. But we're gonna see this progress pattern again and again that in some ways and in some measures of progress is definitely progress, but in other ways is detrimental to our human health and causing this epidemic, setting the stage for it, if you will. So the things that protected metabolic health were not dramatically ripped and stripped away. It's just over time. All right, so let's talk about food, because that is really where the story accelerates. Is the 50s and 60s, the American food industry underwent a revolution. New technology.
Food industry by itself is changing from, I think, if I recall correctly, during the Great Depression and even I think through World War II, I think it was something like 90% of the food consumed in the United States came from like home gardens. Mm-hmm. Like it was, very much, farm to table meant I was going outside and getting the food. And now I think I'm going to the grocery store. In fact, I'm almost producing none of the things that I eat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because you've got food processing, food preservation, and when food preservation first began, it was canning, freezing. Mm-hmm. It wasn't more of the chemicals and the different preservation things that we see these days. Like it started small and then it got to massive scale, skipped across the country, keeping things shelf stable for months or even years. And then you have frozen dinners that appeared. Fast food chains began to spread. Convenience really became the dominant value in food culture. So,
and I think with a growing middle class around that time, like you can actually afford to go out to eat at a restaurant or whatever. That's part of doing better. Anybody listening to this podcast should recognize it's way more expensive to eat out than it is to eat at home. Maybe more convenient, but or less convenient to eat at home. But it's certainly more affordable.
Yeah, and this is in this food revolution, infrastructure is being built. The factories, the supply chains, the marketing systems, especially the cultural expectation that food should be fast, cheap, require no preparation. So the table is being set, pun completely intended, for what is coming. And during this same period, the American diet also started to shift away from fiber. How long did that take? We
got to work it in every episode. I think
we always joke about how long it takes us to get to mention fiber or beans or something in the episode. So this is something I'm just going to keep talking about because it's one of the most underappreciated factors in this entire epidemic. Mm-hmm. So in the early 20th century, Americans consumed substantially more fiber than they do today. Diets were rich in whole grains, legumes, root vegetables, other plant foods that were naturally high in fiber. Estimates vary, but dietary fiber in the early 1900s was likely above 25 grams for most adults. Today, we know that the average American consumes about 10 to 15 grams of fiber. Definitely a collapse because the recommended intake is still 25 to 38 grams per day.
And if I recall correctly from our fibers and new protein episode, I think it's 90% of Americans are deficient in fiber intake.
It is abysmal. It is abysmal. So, and so when you look at that, it used to be the message around fiber was it's basically roughage. Mm-hmm. It's good for digestion. It's indigestible, keeps you regular, just kind of boring.
Filler. Yeah.
Yeah. And that narrative, with more and more research that comes out, you're really seeing that was such a overly simplistic, pretty much false narrative of the role of fiber, because fiber is one of the most powerful regulators in the human diet. It slows absorption of glucose into the bloodstream, which reduces the spikes of glucose and reduces insulin spikes in response to that glucose. It feeds beneficial bacteria in the gut, which produce that butyrate, that short chain fatty acid in there, which reduces inflammation. It increases satiety, meaning you feel fuller, longer, and eat less overall. And it modulates the gut microbiome in ways that we're only really beginning to fully understand. Like there's some really great research there, but it hasn't fully elucidated all of the ways in which the gut microbiome is affected by fiber. A major systematic review and meta-analysis published in The Lancet in 2019 by Reynolds and colleagues, analyzed data from 185 prospective studies and 58 clinical trials. They found that people with the highest fiber intake had a 15 to 30% reduction in all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and, important for what we do, type 2 diabetes incidence compared with people eating 15 to 30%.
30%, okay.
So you compare those eating the most to the people eating the least, and you get anywhere from a 15 to 30% reduction in all-cause mortality there. So 15 to 30% risk from fiber. They're controlling for all other things. They're taking similar people, similar groups, all of this. And yet this was quietly removed from the food supply over the course of a few decades by replacing whole foods with refined process alternatives. And so it is a myth that fiber is just helping move things along, or that it's just providing bulk or what have you. If public health had understood in the 1960s the role of fiber, would we be where we are today? I mean, you can always say like, woulda, coulda, woulda, shoulda, hindsight being 2020 and all of that. I
don't think it would have mattered. I really don't, because when you say public health to me, I don't think it means anything. We just had the revision of the food guide pyramid where they kind of turned things upside down, but people weren't following the original one either. And they didn't even know that had been updated more than a decade.
Exactly. So it's interesting to say the guidelines don't work, but then
I think they're coming from a right place, but there is no teeth from an enforcement standpoint to say
no teeth from an enforcement standpoint. Oh, you mean enforcing on the companies, not people. Okay.
Well, I'm saying so when you're talking Department of Health, big national policy type stuff, there's not really there's a resistance, at least inside the United States, to any impediment to our freedom. Mm-hmm. We have the freedom to make not good choices. Now, maybe a lot of times we make those choices from a lack of education, but cigarettes is a perfect example. There's all the education out there that to include on the package that I'm purchasing. This is not good for you. This is not something, but they still exist. And a ton of people still smoke. Now it has decreased, but I'm curious that it can still it can still be a practice that we can do at the prevalence that it is, with all of the just ton of information spelling out that cigarettes have no redeeming value.
Well, when it was introduced, that was not the introduction to cigarettes in this country. The introduction was, this is a fun thing. This is healthy. Everybody's doing it. And so then when you introduce it and try to take it away, like, we're the parent of 3 kids. We're the parents. We are the parent. We're the parents of 3 now teenagers. But I mean, that it's easier to not introduce something than to introduce something and then take it away later. And that's a whole other
I think thing. That ultimately what we're going to get into is that, we could have the best intentions as parents, but I'm never going to be able to protect, air quotes, my children from all of the bad food choices that exist outside the house.
Yes, but and that's also why we're having this whole discussion about why this is a systemic, system-wide issue.
That's kind of what I'm getting at, is that, you're not set up for success. And we're going to continue to make that case, but that, from a personal responsibility standpoint, you're not responsible for drowning if you're being held underwater.
That's a great analogy.
You did breathe in the water and it did fill your lungs and ultimately kill you, but there was some outside influence that was maybe beyond your control.
You didn't drive yourself to the beach. You didn't put the weight belt around your waist. Yeah.
Did not place the hand on top of your head and push you beneath the waves. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings us to Act 3. Okay. Act 3, the acceleration. And this is our kind of childhood. This is 1970 to 1995. So for me, this is the decade I was born and the decade I graduated high school, right here. And for you as well, I think. Yeah, for sure. I do know when you were born. Anyway, 1970s. This is when the story catches fire. Multiple forces converged in a single decade that fundamentally reshaped the American metabolic environment. And I want to walk through this carefully because this is the period that more than any other built the epidemic that we're living in today. And I feel like we felt it. Like, I remember my mom being on diets left and right, the cabbage soup diet, the hot dog diet, as if, I'm
going to give a shout out to my buddy, Matt. We just had a conversation about this. So he may want to go check out the hot dog diet, because that's his wheelhouse. He is all about the street meat.
No. And I distinctly remember eating those processed hot dogs with the cheese down the center. I can't believe I ate that. It was disgusting. But yeah, I mean, this was the introduction, and I distinctly remember like growing through life with this. And I do remember force number 1, which is the dietary fat panic. And it's interesting that I remember it because this is not in the late 1960s, not 1600s. In the 60s and 70s, I was not born in the 60s. A powerful consensus emerged in American nutrition science, driven in large part by the work of Ansel Keys, which we also talk about in the cholesterol and the lipid episode that we have. That dietary fat, and particularly saturated fat, was the primary driver of heart disease. And that led to the first U.S. dietary guidelines for Americans in 1980, which told Americans to reduce their fat intake. And America listened. fat consumption went down. But what happened next is the food industry, faced with the challenge of making low-fat food that still tasted good, turned to two primary substitutes, which were sugar and refined carbohydrates. So you had low-fat yogurt loaded with sugar, low-fat crackers made with refined flour, fat-free dressings. I remember looking at the nutrition facts of some of those. I'm like, what is even in here? It was like no ingredient that I recognized in the label whatsoever. But at this time, they upped the sugar content, namely high fructose corn syrup, to try to replace the fat that they took away. So the entire food landscape shifted toward a model that was, metabolically speaking, worse for glucose regulation than the high-fat diets that it replaced.
Additionally, and I don't know if you're going to touch on this, but when I think, so you're talking 70s to 80s, all that kind of stuff.
And then in 1980, it was like
getting into our
anti-fat.
generation, so I feel like we can kind of speak from a little bit of lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
Like Saturday morning with my butt in front of the TV watching the cartoons, and I'm trying to think, and I remember a lot of them, of all of the advertisements that I'm seeing in between the Smurfs and whatever else.
When our kids roll our eyes when we play like
for something that I think objectively is probably not anything you want to eat if you have diabetes. It was all sugary treats. It was marketed as maybe like a part of a balanced breakfast. Fruit Loops has no part in your
part of a balanced breakfast.
But that was constantly the snacks and the candies. It's Sunny
and
Delight.
We can all sing the songs.
All of these foods specifically being marketed to young people. I'm gonna just go out on a limb. Probably 90% of it is incredibly high in processed sugars. And that is, the vast majority of what I'm being conditioned to want, to respond, to seek out is going to bite me in the butt several decades later.
Yeah. And that processed foods topic ties directly into one of the most damaging myths of the 21st century, which is calories in, calories out, that all calories are created the same. Now, calories in, calories out is not untrue, but there's a lot of nuance. And this is something that, at least from my perspective as a dietitian, diabetes educator in this environment, is that the lack of nuance that I've seen show up when discussing food and nutrition related topics is really astounding. So this idea that the calories are the same, like a calorie of broccoli is the same as a calorie of soda, and that they're doing the same thing inside your body is problematic. That weight management is just simply math. And if you're gaining weight, you're simply eating too much. And so that dominant message that's been around for decades is deeply misleading. So in 2019, Dr. Kevin Hall and colleagues at the National Institutes of Health published a landmark randomized control trial in cell metabolism. So your randomized control trials are like the gold standard of trials. And they housed participants in a metabolic ward. I can't imagine how much money this study cost.
This is hungry college kids. I can tell you right now, they just, you're going to feed me for free, and all I have to do is like
the cost of
show
the
up and maybe sleep. Yeah. This is some broke college kids. I can tell you right
Probably, yes.
Probably getting extra credit.
Probably. So they housed the participants in a metabolic ward, meaning every bite of food was controlled and measured. They gave them either an ultra-processed diet or an unprocessed diet, and they matched these for available calories, sugar, fat, fiber, and macronutrients. But the calories were not controlled. Participants could eat as much as they wanted. Just the composition of your macronutrients was equally matched. And the results were striking. So the people on the ultra-processed diet consumed approximately 500 more calories a day. They obviously gained weight given the additional calories. And people on the unprocessed diet lost weight. Same macros, same access, but different metabolic outcome. The calories or calories model could not explain this, but what it could explain, or what could begin to explain it, is the idea of the food matrix, the processing, the speed of digestion, the hormonal response to different foods, the effect on satiety signaling, fiber. Ultra-processed food bypasses the body's natural appetite regulation systems. They're engineered, and I use that word deliberately, they are engineered to promote overconsumption.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say food science as a career probably did not exist maybe prior to the very, like we were talking the 1926 to 1945. Like you weren't going to go to university to become a food scientist and develop new foods. That just
no. But during this time, absolutely, there are food scientists.
I'm just kind of speaking to there is some thought to how we got here. They may not have predicted the final outcomes, but there was some intentionality as far as why they're doing a thing.
Yes, and who is hiring the food scientists? The largest corporations in the world are who is hiring the food scientists, and I'm not painting these individuals as villains. You know, my degree is in nutrition and food science. I would not call myself a villain, because many food scientists are solving legitimate technical problems like shelf stability, food safety, cost reduction, flavor consistency. But the cumulative effects of their work was the creation of a food environment that the human metabolic system was never designed to handle.
Or certainly cannot adapt to quick enough to offset the negative side effects of that change in the food composition.
And today, according to research published in the British Medical Journal, Open, ultra-processed foods account for nearly 58% of total caloric intake in the United States and contribute almost 90% of added sugar intake.
Wow.
That's not a subtle shift. That is a complete transformation of the food supply in roughly 2 generations. So then we talked about force number 1 being anti-fat, that movement. Force number 2 is high fructose corn syrup. So in 1970, Japanese scientists developed an efficient enzymatic process for converting cornstarch into high fructose corn syrup. And by the late 1970s, American food manufacturers had embraced it enthusiastically, in part because of U.S. corn subsidies, which made it extraordinarily cheap. Between 1970 and 2000, per capita consumption of high fructose corn syrup in the United States increased by more than, I feel like a millennial when I say this, 1,000%. It's not funny, but it's funny. And fructose, when consumed in large quantities, particularly in liquid form like soft drinks, is metabolized differently than glucose. It goes primarily to the liver, where it promotes de novo lipogenesis, meaning the creation of new fat. It contributes to visceral fat accumulation, insulin resistance, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And this is where everybody's like, it's fruit, don't eat fruit. No, it is high fructose corn syrup. For the last time I will die on this hill, it is not fruit.
Just eat the fruit.
I feel so much better getting that off my chest. So the flood of cheap liquid fructose into the American diet coincided almost perfectly with the steepening of the diabetes curve. Force number
1,000%.
1,000%. Force number 3, the collapse. This is another like, ooh, get Amber angry. The collapse of physical education. And I thankfully got out of high school before this, but I was just beginning my interest in nutrition science.
We've seen this in our own kids. Yeah. This is a very real, almost non-existent for the current generation that is coming up, is a complete de-emphasis on physical activity during the day at school.
Yeah. And it makes me so sad because I remember the Presidential Physical Fitness Award. I remember Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I remember getting my little Presidential Physical Fitness medals and being so proud of them. And that became a part of my identity as someone who was strong and moved and
like a lifelong athlete.
Yeah, it really, that if I had to point like where it began, it was that, plus part of that were these timed little 50-meter dashes or what have you. Mm-hmm. And I would win a lot. That plus hide and go seek and all that playing as a kid. You tend to like what you're good at. And I found something I was good at within that. And it changed the trajectory of my movement for me. And I think about, what if I had not had that, how different movement would have played in my life. Drastically different. So this is one that I really feel strongly about and want to talk about. So gradually, systematically, and most importantly, without scientific justification, they removed this physical activity in schools. So I'm going to walk you through it because I think this is one of the most revealing chapters in this murder mystery story that we're creating. So in the 1950s and early 1960s, physical education was a standard, often daily part of the American school experience. Partly driven by Cold War anxiety, President Eisenhower established the President's Council on Youth Fitness. And this is the one that I was the American Council on Physical Activity, same. In 1956, after studies showed American children were less physically fit than European children, because we cannot be second
specifically
at
those
anything.
Russian children.
We got to get them.
Yeah.
And then President Kennedy expanded the initiative, famously championing physical fitness as a matter of national strength. Isn't that interesting? How things come around. Anyway, for the next 2 decades, PE was woven into the fabric of public education. Kids ran, they played, they climbed, they competed, they moved their bodies every single school day. And by the way, this wasn't just good for their health. There's strong evidence that physical activity enhances cognitive function in children. A 2013 review published in Pediatrics by Singh and colleagues analyzed 14 longitudinal studies and found a significant positive relationship between physical activity and academic performance in children. A landmark study by Hillman and colleagues published in Neuroscience in 2008 demonstrated that even single bouts of aerobic exercise improved attentional control and cognitive flexibility in children, as measured by event-related brain potential data. Don't ask me what that is, but it's fine. I didn't do the study. I'm just talking about it. And a comprehensive review by Donnelly and colleagues in 2016, published in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, concluded that physical activity is associated with improved cognitive function, brain structure, and academic achievement in youth. So the evidence is clear. Physical movement does not compete with learning. It supports and enhances learning. And yet, starting in the 1980s and accelerating dramatically after the passage of No Child Left Behind in 2001, schools across the United States began cutting physical education. The logic, and I use that word very loosely, was that time spent on PE was time taken away from academic subjects, particularly math and reading, which were now tied to high-stakes standardized testing.
Mm-hmm.
Schools that performed poorly on tests faced funding cuts and sanctions, and administrators under enormous pressure started reallocating minutes from physical activity to this. So PE was cut, recess was shortened or eliminated. Art and music, those went away too.
Yeah.
The entire
not helping
school,
me on the test directly. Yeah.
But still, scientifically, yes, it was. The entire school day was restructured around preparing for those standardized tests. And nobody really stopped long enough to say, is this really going to improve test scores? And the evidence strongly suggests that it did not.
Or are the test scores going to meaningfully translate into a better quality of life for these kids 20 years, 30 years down the road?
When you're looking at money, your money allocation, that's not my problem. My problem is these test scores, these standardized tests to get more money for the research. Like, you think you're doing a good thing, you get more money, more resources for your school, but the evidence just suggests that it did not make the test scores better. In fact, research points in the opposite direction. 2010 CDC report titled "The Association Between School-Based Physical Activity, Including Physical Education and Academic Performance," reviewed 50 studies and found that increasing time for physical activity did not negatively affect academic achievement, and in many cases improved it. All the studies that we said before. And so the research showed that giving kids more time to move either had no negative side effects on academics or actually made them perform better. And schools responded by cutting movement. It's one of those it's so many. So by 2016, according to the Center for Disease Control's Youth Risk Behavior Survey, only about 29% of high school students attended daily physical education. In 1991, that number was approximately 42%. And thankfully, I was included, I remember, in that 42%. We had phys ed. And even though I hated changing out in the locker room and having my little uniform to wear, I'm glad that I didn't want to sweat and mess up my hair, but I was glad that we had that still. And even that 1991 figure already was a decline from earlier decades. So meanwhile, the CDC recommends that children and adolescents get at least 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity every day. Most children don't even come close to that. And so we replaced something that we had built in to help them get that 60 minutes of vigorous activity with more sitting and sitting in front of a computer and studying. So just think about that generational impact there. The kids who went through school in the 1990s and 2000s with reduced physical education are now adults in their 30s, pretty much. And they grew up in an environment that normalized sitting for 8 hours a day, that framed exercise as an optional extracurricular activity rather than a fundamental human need. And many of them never developed the movement habits or the physical literacy that previous generations absorbed simply by going to school. It was built in to what they did every day. And then if you take that back to what we said about muscle, skeletal muscle, using that GLUT4 pathway, like it's just that the largest glucose sink you've got in the body.
If everything that you do is practice.
Yeah.
then unintentionally we're practicing a behavior that at least increases your risk for type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
We as a culture, 100% across the board.
Yeah. And this isn't some conspiracy, we're not wearing any kind of tinfoil hats here. This is like, it's no secret meeting of people that said, how can we undermine our American children to make sure they have diabetes later? It was just a policy failure driven by misaligned incentives, political pressure, and fundamental misunderstanding of how the human body and brain actually work, despite the studies being readily available. But the effect was real, and it was devastating. It's still happening. Act 4, and scene. Act 4, the explosion. Are you ready for the explosion? I'm not ready for the explosion, but it's already happened, I guess. We're talking 1995 to 2015.
Okay.
So by the mid-1990s, all the kindling was in place for the fire. Ultra-processed food had become dominant in the food supply. Fiber intake, kaput, bottomed out. Physical activity was declining all across age groups. Suburban sprawl had made car dependency the norm. Schools were cutting physical education. Shift work was increasing. Screen time was beginning its exponential rise. And from a personal standpoint, what I remember is Walmart started becoming, and then they were open 24 hours. Remember when my grandmother was a big, we didn't go to the grocery store on Sundays. Everything was closed on Sundays. If we wanted to go anywhere as kids on a Sunday, I was like, no. And then 5 o'clock, everything was shut down. Don't expect to go to any store past 5 o'clock, and then everything started opening later and later, and then 24 hours. And I remember it being so weird when it first started. Now it's totally the norm, but I do remember that shift. And then 2 more accelerations hit: sleep destruction and chronic stress. So we're going to talk about sleep first. Humans evolved to sleep in alignment with natural light cycles. For thousands of years, when the sun went down, the world got dark, and our biology shifted towards rest. Melatonin.
That was happened more than thousands of years. That's kind of been the norm for ever.
Until maybe Edison and you could even say Tesla. Yeah. Melatonin production increased as your body shifted towards rest. Cortisol dropped, and the body begins to enter repair mode. And the electric light bulb disrupted this. But slowly, what truly shattered human sleep was the combination of 24-hour media, the internet, shift work. It's all Walmart's fault being open 24 hours. I kid. And the blue light emitting screens that became ubiquitous in the late night. Don't sue me, Walmart. I'm just kidding. Became ubiquitous in the late 1990s and 2000s.
It, to me, sounds like there's just always stuff to do, right? At one point in time, if the only light after the sun went down was candlelight, wasn't a great light source. It was a pain in the butt.
Might as well go to bed,
maintain and change, and it was basically
go till the soil
it's
at midnight.
Expensive to keep that stuff burning, and there just really isn't that much stimulating things to do. Versus now, there's always something to do, and it has nothing to do with what time of day it is. It's always available. It's always on, always very interesting and appealing and all the other kind of stuff. Hard to turn away from something that interesting.
Right. And it can disrupt sleep. And today, according to the Centers for Disease Control, roughly 1 in 3 American adults gets less than the recommended 7 hours of sleep per night. And the metabolic consequences are pretty profound. Mm-hmm. A seminal study published in The Lancet in 1999, the authors...
We're recording this in Gainesville, and I heard Seminole study, and I was like, I'm not interested.
You were so funny. A Seminole go Seminoles. The authors of the seminal study were Spiegel, Leprout, and Van Cotier, demonstrated that restricting healthy young men to 4 hours of sleep per night for just 6 nights produced measurable impairments in glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity. Their metabolic profiles began to resemble those of pre-diabetic individuals in less than a week. So I'm going to emphasize that. 6 nights of poor quality sleep made healthy young people look pre-diabetic. Sleep deprivation increases cortisol, increases what I like to call the hunger monster hormone, which is ghrelin, decreases leptin, which is the satiety hormone, promotes cravings for high carb, high fat foods, and impairs the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of the brain that's responsible for decision making and impulse control. So when someone sleeps poorly, they are biologically primed to eat more and to choose worse foods when they do eat more and have less ability to resist those choices. And then we call them weak-willed. So keeps coming back to that because that willpower narrative is so deeply embedded in how we talk about diabetes and obesity. And it's important to say this like very, very clearly. When 136 million American adults, the combined number with diabetes and prediabetes, are affected by the same metabolic condition, that is not a willpower problem.
Yeah.
That is not 136 million individual moral failures happening simultaneously. As the National Academy of Medicine has stated plainly, obesity and type 2 diabetes are primarily driven by environmental and societal factors. The science on this is settled. Mm-hmm. The environment is the cause of the epidemic. Now, chronic stress. We don't have stress. Come on. Modern stress is quite different from the acute stress that our biology has evolved to handle. Yeah. Talking like fight or flight. That is brief. That is a high cortisol event, but it is brief. The cortisol spikes. You survive. It returns to baseline. And modern psychological stress like financial insecurity, work pressure, social isolation. Social isolation. Isolation of the socials. Social isolation, caregiving demands, housing inequality, that's chronic. And that causes the cortisol to stay elevated. And chronically elevated cortisol does terrible things to metabolism. Raises blood glucose by stimulating gluconeogenesis in the liver. It promotes visceral fat accumulation, particularly that around the abdomen fat, which is the most metabolically dangerous type of fat. It disrupts appetite signaling. It impairs sleep. It creates a feedback loop in which stress drives metabolic dysfunction, and then metabolic dysfunction drives more stress. So research published in Obesity Reviews was among the first to establish a clear mechanistic link between chronic psychosocial stress, cortisol dysregulation, and the development of abdominal obesity in insulin resistance. And this work has been confirmed and expanded by multiple subsequent studies. And here's the socioeconomic dimension that ties it all together. The communities with the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the United States are overwhelmingly communities that also experience the highest levels of chronic stress. So your low-income neighborhoods, communities of color, rural areas with limited healthcare access, food deserts where the nearest grocery store is miles away, but the nearest gas station with these highly processed foods, ultra-processed foods, is right on the corner. It's not coincidence that the diabetes epidemic follows economic and social fault lines with stunning precision, just right along. And according to the National Diabetes Statistics Report, the prevalence of diagnosed diabetes is significantly higher among African American adults, non-Hispanic Black adults, if you will, Hispanic adults, and Indian and Alaskan Native adults compared to non-Hispanic white adults. It's higher among people with lower education levels, higher among people with lower household incomes, and that is what a systems problem looks like.
Right.
The people with the least access to whole food, safe neighborhoods for walking, quality health care, adequate sleep, and relief from financial stress are people with the highest rates of diabetes. That their environment is making them sick. And seen.
So that's a lot.
There's more.
There's more.
There's more. We have Act 5. we have a lot of acts.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah, we're not done.
Oh boy.
You ready to keep going?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, Act 5. The hidden machinery. This is fun. The microbiome and inflammation. Oh, so I want to go deeper. Because everything we've talked about so far, the food, the movement, the sleep, the stress, these converge onto two biological systems that most people really have not heard much in the context of diabetes: the gut microbiome and chronic inflammation. So we're going to start with the microbiome. Your gut contains trillions of microorganisms, and these include bacteria, fungi, viruses that collectively weigh somewhere between 2 and 4 pounds in your body. This microbial community is not a passive bystander. It's an active metabolic organ within your body. It influences immune function, nutrient absorption, hormone production, and very critically, as it relates to diabetes, glucose metabolism and insulin sensitivity.
Okay.
So research over the past 2 decades has revealed that the composition of the gut microbiome significantly differs in people with type 2 diabetes compared to metabolically healthy individuals. So people with diabetes tend to have reduced microbial diversity and lower populations of beneficial bacteria that produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. And butyrate strengthens the intestinal barrier, reduces systemic inflammation, and improves insulin sensitivity. So you're seeing less butyrate in people who have type 2 diabetes. And what shapes this microbiome is primarily environment and diet. Fiber feeds that beneficial bacteria. Diverse plant intake promotes microbial diversity, whereas ultra-processed foods, antibiotics, and low-fiber diets do the opposite. They reduce diversity and promote the growth of bacterial species that are associated with inflammation and metabolic disease. A landmark 2012 study published in Nature by Quinn and colleagues performed metagenomic sequencing of the gut microbiomes of 345 Chinese individuals and found that type 2 diabetes was associated with gut microbial dysbiosis with reductions in butyrate-producing bacteria and increasing the opportunistic pathogens. So essentially what I just said, but that was the study that kind of elucidated that. So when we reshaped the food supply, when we replaced whole grains with refined flour, beans with processed snacks, and diverse plant foods with a narrow range of ultra-processed products, we didn't just change what we were eating. We changed the ecosystem within our bodies. We starved the bacteria that protected metabolic health, and we fed the ones that undermined health. So it's kind of like we took out that really rich cow manure, earthworm, black soil. We took that out and we just put in some filler dirt, that topsoil. It's not the same, and your body doesn't treat it the same. And it leads directly to inflammation because a disrupted microbiome is one of the major drivers of chronic low-grade inflammation, which is now understood to be at the very heart of type 2 diabetes. So for a very long time, and I would argue still to this day, diabetes is framed as a sugar disease. Mm-hmm. My sugar diabetes, you eat too much sugar, your blood sugar goes up, that's the problem.
Yeah.
End of story. No, because the thought was if you can just get the blood sugar numbers down, then you've solved it. And that framing is wildly inadequate. And it's the last major myth that I would like to address in our murder mystery story, if you will. So type 2 diabetes is not simply a disease of elevated blood glucose. It is a multi-system metabolic disease involving insulin resistance, beta cell dysfunction, chronic inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, hormonal disruption, and gut immune interactions. And if you want to dive into that further, we have 12 plus podcast episodes on the core defects of
it's where we started.
Type 2. It's where we started. So they're a little rougher, a little more rough. But if you really geek out on that kind of thing, you can dive into those. I welcome you to.
Or if you don't have diabetes and want to sleep for 12 hours.
Yeah. If you're having trouble getting your 7 to 8 hours of sleep, put that on. No, it's not that bad. It might be. Yeah. Anyway.
It can be dry at times.
It can be.
All of this is you do a really good job of taking some high level concepts and hopefully distilling it down to something, more palatable. But,
and if I don't, you interject and you're like, what?
But and we've said it before, this is the reason why you can't just not eat white stuff. There's a lot more going on.
A lot more. Yeah.
To get you to a point where systems, plural, are failing. Yep. In your body. Yep.
Speaking of a lot more going on, let's talk about inflammatory cytokines.
Oh boy.
Shall we? So those
are my least favorite kind of cytokines.
That's so funny. So these are signaling molecules that are produced by immune cells, and they play a direct role in the development and progression of insulin resistance. You've got tumor necrosis factor alpha. You might see it in studies as TNF alpha for those of you read those things. Anyway, was one of the first cytokines shown to interfere with insulin signaling. Research published in Science I'm not even going to try to say the author. Hadamus Ligil.
Nailed it.
Sorry. I did it. I said it. I wasn't going to. Hadamus Ligil and colleagues published in Science in 1993 demonstrated that tumor necrosis factor alpha was overexpressed in the adipose tissue of obese animals and that it directly impaired insulin receptor function. And then subsequent research has confirmed that interleukin-6, C-reactive protein, and other inflammatory markers are elevated in people with type 2 diabetes and contribute to disease progression. In other words, the immune system is involved, very much so. The inflammation is not a side effect of diabetes. It is a driver of diabetes. And the modern environment, through ultra-processed food, disrupted sleep, chronic stress, microbiome changes, sedentary behavior, and visceral fat accumulation, that's all pro-inflammatory, creating inflammation throughout. And every thread of this story leads back to the same place, and that is that the environment has changed. The body responded, and the response across hundreds of millions of people worldwide is what we now call the diabetes epidemic. Ready for Act 6? This is the genetic question, okay? Because people are going to push back and say, what about genetics? My mom had diabetes. My grandma had my grandfather, it runs in my family.
Yeah.
And they are not wrong that genetics plays a role. Family history is a real risk factor in type 2 diabetes. So when we talk about risk factors for type 2, age is number one. Ethnicity is number two. Family history is another one that plays a role. So certain genetic variants affect insulin secretion, insulin sensitivity, beta cell function, and fat distribution, whether you're an apple body shape or a pear, whether you store your fat around your abdomen and midsection, that is genetic, versus whether you store it around your hips and thighs.
Well, when you're saying age, really what you're talking about is exposure. Right. Like if I'm in a carcinogenic environment for longer, the risk of cancer increases. If you're in and I think we've pretty well demonstrated that you are living in the diabetogenic environment, the longer you're exposed to the environment, the greater your risk of developing diabetes.
Yes. And these are all typically slow progressing things, to your point. But here's what genetics cannot explain. In 1958, when we're going back, the prevalence of diagnosed diabetes in the United States was approximately 1.5%.
Okay.
Versus now, it's over 11%.
And this is type 2 diabetes.
Yes,
correct?
this is diagnosed diabetes. Well, we're going to talk about type 1 and how that has also increased. So all diabetes, 1.5% in 1958 to somewhere between 11 and 12%. It's like 11.3 to 11.5 in there. But then when you include pre-diabetes, as we mentioned earlier, we're talking about half the population that's affected. Pre-diabetes plus type 2. So that is roughly a 7-fold increase in diagnosed diabetes in about 65 years.
Yeah.
And human genetics just cannot shift that fast. It takes thousands of years for meaningful genetic changes to propagate through a population. But what can change in 65 years is the environment.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite quotes, this was by Dr. Walter Willett of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, who put it that genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger, which means genetics determine your susceptibility, but the environment determines whether that susceptibility is activated. And what happened over the past century is that we built an environment so metabolically hostile that it activated genetic susceptibility in hundreds of millions of people who, in a different environment, might have never developed the disease of type 2 diabetes.
And I think you see that, in folks that can, we advocate for a lot of changes in the populations that actually successfully implement those changes. Really, in a matter of weeks, you start to see the reversal, but that remission start to kick in. The metabolic environment changes as a direct result of changing that external environment.
Absolutely. And another way you could think of it is if you have a genetic predisposition for type 2 diabetes, say, and you live in 1926, eating whole foods, walking everywhere you go, sleeping with the sun, working physically, your risk is present, but it might never materialize. Now, you take that same genetic profile, plop it into 2026, ultra-processed food, sedentary work, disrupted sleep, chronic stress, no physical activity in school, screens everywhere you look. And that genetic, those same genes that were never someone with type 2 diabetes in 1926, that person doesn't stand a chance.
I'm gonna put it a different way. If you sweat gasoline, you should probably avoid open flames. There's a lot of fire outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a good one.
That's what I'm here for.
Act 7. Here we go. So a brief but important note on type 1. So before we're going to talk about like solutions to everything that we've ever discussed, not that we've ever, everything we talked about.
We're going to solve everything on this podcast
all the issues
right here.
Ever. I want to pause and acknowledge something that is something that people who are paying attention have noticed, but it might surprise other people, and even the cause isn't fully elucidated. But type 1 diabetes incidence has also been increasing globally for decades, and the International Diabetes Federation estimates that type 1 diabetes incidence has been rising at approximately 3% per year in many countries.
Per year?
Yes, 3% per year. That's not...
Keeping up with inflation.
That's very significant, yes. And then type 1 is an autoimmune disease. It's not caused by diet or lifestyle in the way that type 2 is. The immune system is attacking the insulin-producing beta cells of the pancreas. So why is it increasing? And the honest answer is that it's not fully known. There are research studies that suggest certain things.
Is it possible that these are just the most sensitive to the environmental pressures?
I think that anything is up for possibility. You know, a lot of things are being discussed, but the leading hypotheses at this time all point again to what you just kind of postulated was this environmental change. Viral triggers, certain enterovirus infections are associated with increased risk. Microbiome disruption in early life, possibly from a cesarean birth or early antibiotic exposure or formula feeding. Those are all being kind of explored. Vitamin D deficiency, which has become increasingly common as people spend less time outdoors. The so-called hygiene hypothesis, which suggests that reduced early life exposure to diverse microorganisms may lead to immune dysregulation. Many of you probably remember might still have your antibacterial soaps when that really exploded in the late 90s and early 2000s. A lot of studies on the fact that made they're like these superbugs, super bacteria. And so I think the premise is all that environmental toxins also might affect immune function in ways that we don't yet fully understand. But most researchers, they almost all believe that it's some complex interaction between genetic predisposition and environmental triggers. And the key point is that even type 1 diabetes, which is a disease with a very strong autoimmune component, appears to be influenced by the same broad environmental changes that are driving type 2. So the environment is still a common thread, even if you can't point to what exactly it is in the environment that's doing it. It's very likely still the environment. Act 8, the century in review. So we're going to step back and look at the full arc of what happened between 1926 and 2026, current day. And in the 1920s and 30s, we had a population who ate whole food, moved consistently, slept well, lived with relatively low diabetes rates. Insulin had just been discovered for a disease that was pretty rare. Mm-hmm. In the 1940s and 50s, the post-war economic transformation began reshaping daily life. Suburbs replaced walkable towns. Cars replaced walking. The food industry began industrializing the American diet. The slow, invisible erosion of metabolic production the erosion of metabolic protection had begun. In the 1960s and 70s, the dietary fat panic led to low-fat policies that paradoxically increased sugar and refined carb consumption. High fructose corn syrup enters the food supply. Ultra-processed food began its takeover of the American diet. Fiber intake declined. The diabetes curve began to bend upward. In the 1980s and 90s, schools started cutting physical education. Screen time rose, shift work expanded, sleep quality deteriorated, chronic stress became the default mode for millions of Americans, particularly those in lower socioeconomic brackets. Fast food chains became the most prominent restaurants in the country. Food deserts formed in communities that could least afford the consequences of those food deserts. In the 2000s and 2010s, the smartphone arrived. Sitting became the norm for work, school, and leisure. Ultra-processed foods reached its current dominance of nearly 60% of the American caloric supply. The microbiome research revolution revealed that we'd been disrupting an internal ecosystem we didn't even know existed.
Yeah, and 2 to 4 pounds of those guys.
Yeah. And the diabetes numbers kept climbing. And now it's 2026. 4 generations have passed since 1926. And the cumulative result of 100 years of environmental change is a metabolic catastrophe affecting nearly half of the adult population of the richest country in the history of the world. And that is the crime scene. So who is guilty, you ask?
I'm almost hesitant to ask because, again, like I don't know that blame is certainly not going to promote healing.
Well, and there is no single villain. Yeah. That's the thing. There is no one person or one company or one policy that created this. It was the accumulation of systems, food systems, economic systems, transport systems, education, healthcare, each making decisions that were individually rational but collectively devastating. Mm-hmm. The food industry wanted to sell more products. Policymakers wanted to improve test scores. Urban planners wanted to accommodate cars. Economists wanted to reduce food costs. Healthcare focused on treating disease rather than preventing it. And we talk a lot about that throughout our episodes. And through all of it, the dominant cultural narrative said that if you got sick, it was your own fault and you didn't try hard enough. And that narrative, the willpower myth, might be the most destructive element of all. Because as long as we frame diabetes as a personal failing, we're never going to hold the systems accountable. We never redesign the environment that caused it in the first place. We just keep blaming people who are drowning in a flood that they didn't create.
Stop breathing water. Stop breathing water. Stop breathing water.
Exactly. Yeah. Act 9, what would it take? So let's end this with a question, because I think that the best conversations begin with a good question. And so let's ask a different question. What if the world's leading experts, not just endocrinologists, but economists, public health leaders, urban planners, sociologists, educators, psychologists, physiologists, dietitians, environmental scientists, if they all gathered in a room and asked, what would it take to reverse this diabetes epidemic? What would they say? This dream summit, if you will, based on the evidence that some of which we've discussed here, I think the recommendations would fall into a few categories, major categories. The first is food. The first is food policy, also known as food, food policy reform. The evidence is clear that ultra-processed food is a primary driver of the epidemic. Meaningful solutions would include economic disincentives for ultra-processed food and economic incentives for whole food. Things like subsidizing fruits, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains, the way that we currently subsidize corn and soy. Yeah. We're doing this just for different products. Transparent, science-based food labeling that tells consumers what they're actually eating. Regulation of food marketing to children, which multiple countries have already begun implementing. And reforming institutional food in schools, hospitals, prisons, military bases, so that the food provided in public institutions actually supports metabolic health. Second would be rebuilding movement into daily life. So it's not about telling people just go to the gym. This is about redesigning the environment so that movement is the default and not the exception to the norm. Walkable communities, safe cycling infrastructure. I don't think I've got a little bit triggered, if you will. I was on the socials at one point, and this guy was like, I can't stand when bikes are in my way in the road. And like to his point, I get it. If you're, especially, you want to cycle before work, it's kind of dark, or after work, it's dark. And if you come up on a bicycle, it can be scary, and you don't want to hit, and you want to make sure people are safe. Safe cycling infrastructure is needed. Maybe roads are not the best place for bikes, but in the absence of a different place, you're kind of stuck with
there's a lot
road.
of countries that do this successfully. Netherlands is a perfectly good example.
Yep, it can be done because other countries are doing it. Public parks and green spaces, and critically restoring physical education in schools. I feel so strongly about this. Not having it as an elective or an afterthought, as a daily non-negotiable part of every child's education. And we could even go for nutrition education with that as well, because I think Japan does an amazing job of incorporating nutrition into their daily curriculum for kids. Because it's all supported by overwhelming evidence, especially frog in my throat. It's all supported by overwhelming evidence, especially with physical activity, because we talked earlier about how it improves both health and academic performance. The research is there. The CDC has reviewed it. Dozens of research and researchers have confirmed it. There is no scientific basis for cutting physical activity to improve test scores. The policy was wrong, and it should be reversed. That word should, but if Amber ruled the world. Third is healthcare reform. So our current system is designed to manage diabetes after it develops, not to prevent it from developing in the first place.
Even up to and including a diagnosis of pre-diabetes does not mandate like medical and lifestyle intervention.
Right. Yeah. Right. We'll tell you to do it, but not how.
Yeah.
And a prevention-oriented approach would include universal metabolic screening, not just of fasting glucose, but fasting insulin levels, hemoglobin A1C, lipid panels, inflammatory markers, starting much earlier in life. And to have those, you would also have insurance coverage for nutrition for those labs, plus nutrition counseling, lifestyle medicine programs, and continuous glucose monitoring for people who are at risk. And a fundamental, so like when I say continuous glucose monitoring, it's for people at risk and through the guidance of someone who can interpret that, a qualified person to interpret it, which is very different than some of the things that are happening now with CGMs. Or continuous glucose monitors.
Let me clarify a little bit. You're speaking to the healthy person, going to the gym all the time and really of a relatively lean body composition that may or may not have listened to an influencer that is pushing a CGM for longevity medicine solution.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And maybe a fundamental shift in medical education to ensure that every doctor understands metabolic, nutritional, and economic drivers of type 2 diabetes, not just how to prescribe metformin.
Yeah.
And like they don't have to be dietitians, of course. That's a whole profession with a master's degree in it or doctorate. In and of itself,
but it sounds to me like,
just like basic.
Yeah. But I mean, like what you're describing is almost like I go to the doctor's office. There's a whole long list of things that I go through prior to seeing my physician. Do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? I mean, you could almost do the same for like an environmental survey, for lack of a better description. Do you have access to whatever, all these kind of questions that would educate this person is going to be at increased risk for disease.
And to be fair, a lot of those screening tools do exist, but how much are they utilized? What do you do with that information? How do you take action on it once you have it is a whole different environmental thing that much of which we've discussed here. Fourth is addressing socioeconomic determinants of health. You cannot solve the diabetes epidemic without addressing poverty, food insecurity, housing instability, and structural racism. Communities that lack access to whole food, safe places to move and exercise, quality sleep environments, and adequate health care, they're going to continue to bear a disproportionate burden of metabolic disease, regardless of what individual interventions are offered. The social determinants of health are the metabolic determinants of health. And fifth is cultural change. Normalizing movement as a fundamental human need and not a luxury for people with gym memberships. We need to normalize cooking as a life skill, not a hobby. Normalizing sleep as a pillar of health, not a sign of laziness. And retire permanently this narrative that diabetes is caused by individual weakness. That creates shame. Shame is the lowest energetic form. It's not helpful. We've talked about that a lot. But this is caused by systems. And if it is caused by systems, it can only be solved by systems.
Yep.
So it's a big list. And I don't pretend that it's easy, but what gives me hope is that type 2 diabetes develops slowly over years, sometimes over decades, and the same biology that allows it to develop slowly allows it to improve. And in many cases, not so slowly. It can improve slowly or it can improve quickly, depending on the inputs, the things that change around you. So when you improve food quality, increase movement, restore sleep, reduce chronic stress, support the microbiome, the body responds in kind to that. Insulin sensitivity can improve, inflammation can decrease, beta cell function can recover, particularly in the early stages of the disease. And it's not wishful thinking. There was a trial, the diabetes prevention program trial showed that lifestyle intervention reduced the incidence of type 2 diabetes by 58%, which was way more effective than metformin, which is one of the easiest and best pills out there.
Typically first
for
response
type 2.
for a diagnosis of type 2. Yeah.
And that's what the research shows. That is what we see every single day in people who come through empowered diabetes. The body is not broken, but the environment broke the conditions that the body needs to function. You change those conditions and the body is incredibly capable of healing. So I'm just going to wrap it all up with this. 100 years ago, diabetes was rare. 4 generations, maybe 5 generations later, it affects nearly half the adult population in the United States. It's not your fault, but it can be your fight. It's our fight. And we're here with the people listening, ready to change it in any way that we can.
Okay. I'm going to go a little bit off script here at this point in time.
Do it.
Every episode, or just about every episode that we do, we try and have some action items at the end. And I think that in this particular episode, we've really illustrated that most of what we talked about today is outside of your control. Okay.
A lot.
So I've got 2 asks.
Yeah.
And we don't normally do this, but the 2 asks I have at an individual level, every person that for whatever reason has listened to the end of this podcast, and God bless you because this was a long one, but every person listening to this either has diabetes or knows somebody with diabetes.
Or is very interested in helping somebody with diabetes.
I want you to forward this particular episode to at least one other person that you know that is struggling with this disease. That's ask number 1. Because this really frames, first off, there are things that you can do, but there's way, way more things that are stacked against your favor that you can't control. Okay? And that should be welcome news to somebody that is struggling with that shame cycle that you've talked about, that has been beating themselves up for years for not being successful at getting a handle on this.
Yeah, I think, if I may, where I would say you could really change is in the perspective of it is the person who has type 2 diabetes. It is their fault that they didn't do something, or just the mindset also of a person with type 2 diabetes instead of a type 2 diabetic. And I hear people who have type 2 diabetes saying, I'm a type 2 diabetic, and just separating the I am statement from the environmental disease, because you are not the environment.
Yeah.
The environment may have shaped you in some way, shape, or form, but that is not your true identity.
So there are things that we can do as individuals to control our individual environment. You want any of those things, please listen to any of our past episodes and listen to most of our episodes going forward, because we're always going to talk to the individual. But the second ask I would have for you today, and this is a big ask. Amber does a ton of research prior to every single one of these episodes to try and compile all this and present it in a logical fashion. Please, 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 if you're listening to this right now, I want you to forward this to your local and state and federal representatives, because as we've just stated, at least half of their voting constituency is either dealing with this problem at its most extreme or will deal with this problem in the future. They're on a path to type 2 diabetes. So if you don't know who your representatives are, this is a good time to figure that out. But every single one of them is way more capable of promoting and voting and instilling policy. Some of the policies that we talked about on the podcast today, they have way more control over those levers to affect your future, your children's future. If there was a policy episode, this is the policy episode, and we cannot do it by ourselves. It is going to take all of us demanding better support from our nation.
Yep.
So
and our corporations.
But the
policies that affect
the policy exactly. It is we elect officials with the expectation that they are going to take care of us. Yeah. And we
pay a lot of money in taxpayer dollars.
We kind of spelled it out as it relates to this particular disease, not just the scale of it, but some very practical ways that our policymakers, that our leadership at every level of government can do a better job of taking care of us.
And we can do a great job of taking care of each other as well.
Absolutely. This has been, without a doubt, the longest episode of the Diabetes Podcast.
I know, it's having too much fun.
If you made it here, thank you. We know this was a lot, but this is the context people deserve. Diabetes is not a mass failure of willpower. It's a predictable response to an environment that changed faster than our biology. Amber and I would like to ask that you first please share this episode with at least one person who has diabetes or is at risk. If shame has been part of their story, we hope this reframes it with science and compassion. Second, send this episode to your local, state, and federal representatives. If you go to https://www.usa.gov/elected-officials, you can find points of contact for your federal, state, and local officials, and we've provided that link in the show notes as well. The solutions we've outlined: food policy, rebuilding movement into daily life, restoring PE in schools, better screening and prevention in healthcare, and addressing social detriments are systems problems that need systems change. At Empowered Diabetes, we've dedicated the rest of our lives to combating this disease, and we'll keep showing up every week with practical steps you can use right now: food, movement, sleep, stress, and microbiome support, because the same biology that let this develop can help you improve it. It's not your fault, but it can be your fight, and we're in it with you. As always, if you have questions or need additional support, you can reach out to us at support@empowereddiabetes.com. Until next time, take courage. We can do this, and you can help.